Well, wrapping up a conference of this kind is not the easiest task. But I would like, first of all, to say thank you for all the great speakers today and all the panelists and adjudicators. It's been a very, very successful day, I think. I'll try not to go on really for too long. And if I go past about 50 minutes, please sing out and stop me. I decided I wouldn't really try to comment at all on Kerry's comments. I noticed that she did point to one or two people in the front two rows and wagged her finger a little bit about what she was actually expecting. And I think Duncan Vescott's name actually came up once or twice in that. But, I'll start really on the two keynote speeches. First, Terry's, that really, as he said, in realizing better initiatives. Well, I think he hit the nail on the head, really, in terms of his national review of architecture and the built environment, particularly the latter, of course, because it does concern the public realm, where we should be promoting high standards of design. I'm trying, incidentally, to sort of read some of my scribbles I've been making through today, so I might come out less than coherent. But one thing Terry did say quite firmly is that really we can't abrogate our responsibilities to the quality of the environment in general. And I think this is the key message. Sustainable environment embraces green infrastructure, public transport, and most certainly placemaking. I'll come to that later because various people have commented on precisely what that is. The potential relevance to Hong Kong is really perhaps arguably less to do with promoting architecture than in helping the built environment create public benefit with a special focus on the city itself. And in this respect, good design, as he said, is indivisible from good planning. We do need, I think, in Hong Kong, something of the equivalent to what Terry's been doing in the UK, an urban design review that will carry weight, and we also need a champion to raise our overall standards, a point made by several of the speakers. For too much of our public realm is really the result of a miscellany of standards, building codes, zoning conditions, and ordinances, which does admittedly give us a very finely managed and highly functional city, and also, I suppose, value engineering, as Kerry would have it, but not necessarily with the placemaking potential. Terry did give us a very comprehensive account of what we need. The Farrell Review does cover many aspects, including education, online resources in schools, a common foundation year for built environment students. I liked his comment on place, planning, landscape, architecture, conservation, and then engineering in inverted commas. E could equally stand for environment, which last time I wrote place in a very similar way. I'm afraid I displaced the engineers. I hope they've all gone home now. Decision makers, in fact, should, obviously, as he said, receive training in design literacy. Every town and city could, as he said, have an urban room or a virtual urban room. We need someone really, as he said, to put the pieces together. And as I said, a champion who can look at things compellingly and make overriding decisions. And in a way, Rocco, I think, echoes this dilemma. As he states, we can both love and yet feel sometimes repelled by the city at one and the same time. We respect the constraints on development. We are concerned about the standard of expectations on the part of the community. But ultimately, we need to be even-minded. And we have to keep in mind some sort of a grand decision through which we can determine urban betterment. Because what we too often end up with is an unhappy compromise that tries to keep all parties happy, even the conflicting ones. So one way or another, we do have to make some clear choices, I think. Rocco also made the point that dreams must be anchored in reality. I love this statement. We do need to remind ourselves of what we like and want and what we actually don't want. And he posed the question, how do we move forward? He talked about building height, open space, connectivity, heritage, architecture. And we always need to bear in mind that, of course, urbanism, as we know it through urban design, it should really be greater than the sum of the parts. And again, one or two other commentators made this point very directly. If we talk about buildings and so on, and we do zone and we design through building ordinances and so on, it tends to point us towards the design of the site rather than the wider neighbourhood, something we should bear in mind. I'll just make another couple of points on the keynotes. I think Lawrence, in answering the question, really raised this issue of a champion for the city, looking at soft rather than hard issues. Sean also stated that we need to manage change and drive forward at many levels. And he also quoted Jane Jacobs very well, I think, that cities simply don't serve the people unless they are created by the people. Martin Berry, founder of Recite, really struck much the same message of collaboration, but in a somewhat different sense, in discussing the role that civic activists are playing in Central and Eastern Europe, in making city environments and using the principles of what he called landscape urbanism. It's a term, actually, I've heard elsewhere. Some of the new urbanists in America use this phrase, landscape urbanism. Recite has certainly grown massively and very quickly into a collaborative platform of partners and experts working with city leaders to shape resilient and livable, and also, of course, in this modern age, competitive cities too. So the central message was that we can extend our understanding of city problems and emerging issues really through more focused initiatives. Leadership, vision, education, and transparency, as Martin put it. And these all act for cities that are resilient and focused on urban design and public space. Chris extended this idea on the basis that the public is the city's greatest creative asset. And he discussed 3 participatory initiatives and research programs based on inherent community creativity in sort of shaping innovative, regenerative proposals for parts of Hong Kong's urban area. I think the title, Hong Kong Urban Genius, is fabulous. And I also like the very real issue of living at the limit. Chris has a very good way of words, there's no doubt about it. And he also asked a very interesting question. How can urban design and environmental activists actually extend their influence, their knowledge, their skills through the community? Many of the stories about the people, the memory of the city, the story of districts, the notion of urban discovery, I like very much. What is an established fact is that people do actually take every opportunity to get involved whenever they can. For example, the example that Chris gave, Instagram group. And I shall definitely be at the very Aberdeen weekend show on the 15th of May. And finally, the very sensible sort of link between the good neighbour scheme, the local community and the general public. It all added up to a lot of common sense to me. On the Q&A, there were some interesting points made. Francesco really made a very interesting, I think, intervention, really, talking about the evolution and changes in some of the excellent rehabilitation programs in Macau. And Jiang Xing talked about the transition of ideas to reality in Hong Kong. We have, of course, in Hong Kong, an almost unique, not quite unique, high-density urbanism, an urbanism of impermanence and reinvention that allows us really to push forward to what we might call a new urbanism in every sense of the word. And I did like Chris's comments on the benefit of muddling through as well. Yes, the best cities are not perfect. Cities of monuments are not necessarily cities for people. And in response to that, I think, and I'm quoting Vincent again, I think he likened this to a jigsaw puzzle, which I also liked, the different pieces. We don't perceive them as pieces, we only see them, in terms of the final picture. The afternoon session, well, this changed course somewhat to sustainable revitalization. Professor Zhu Wenyi, well, as we know, Beijing is an extremely large city, even by international standards, and there are there are many concealed, forgotten spaces, what Professor Zhu called disadvantaged spaces. I won't comment further on that. There's already been a discussion on it. So placemaking really becomes a means of identifying these spaces, their uses and their value to the city and community through their various typologies and the way they react to change in the nature of the localities as and how they develop. Some of these, such as cemeteries, you know, he introduced, I think, an interesting subject, the taboo subject, things like cemetery. And it reminded me very much of Stephen Tang's excellent work with ASD, really excellent work, in completely redesigning columbariums in crematoria in Hong Kong to both work better and to integrate them positively within the community. Stephen gave a really, really excellent talk a couple of months ago at the university about this. One of the best talks I've actually heard in Hong Kong on a very important subject that relates to the real problems of the city and problems of the community. But not only that, you know, the way in which you can completely change the public reaction to these very sensitive things. Dr. Stanley Yip, I think he rightly expressed the view that really urban regeneration is a key frontier for urban growth, as Chinese cities do look on course to absorb perhaps up to 250 million people over the next 40 years. And this necessarily implies a policy framework on low-carbon urbanization, as well as trajectories towards emission control. And he set out various examples of how this can be accomplished. I think it's really important when set against the massive urbanization program, which is likely to amount to perhaps 70% urbanization within the next 20 to 30 years. So urbanization is the major issue here, particularly following the Paris Accord. And I've been involved in China for some time, but I have picked up all sorts of signals, even over the last few months, following the policy accord, that in China, a lot has been coming right down from Beijing as far as the Pearl River Delta. We've got to do better in terms of city building. Otherwise, we're never going to achieve what we think we can achieve in terms of in terms of proper urban regeneration and low carbon urbanization. And this can only be accomplished through, as Stanley said, new urban growth boundaries, ecological redlining, relocation of industry, redevelopment of underutilized properties. So again, urban design and planning in China are becoming part of a statutory process, which I think is a very good thing, and it represents a recalibration of cities, if you like, as green, low-carbon entities. So really, this is, in fact, as regards China, I think, a quite new way of actually looking at physical planning. It involves both mitigation and adaptation, and how you integrate that into a new form of development control. And I think Stanley's examples were excellent. It shows really what can be done in terms of meeting all the essential criteria. It also, in a way, acknowledges the changes that are built into the process. You know, he gave the example of achieving the C40 climate positive framework. Ian Brownlee, Ian took a rather more philosophical line, lamenting the sort of conceptual mismatch between the design ideas and the concept, and the context for implementation. In particular, the design of public spaces and places and the behavioral implications for these. He discussed first the central waterfront. Well, I was the director of the very first waterfront study, and Sean and I worked together, how long ago? Nearly 25 years ago, for Central Wan Chai. And I was also on the jury for the competition that he mentioned. I have to say, I'm not actually a great believer in urban design competitions for all sorts of reasons that have been discussed today. I think urban design is too valuable just to have a conceptual idea and then dream that we can work towards this. But if I might say so, I think our problem is that for a variety of reasons, we've ended up, you know, in much of our reclamation, because of the protection of the harbour ordinance, with far too many straight edges, I said this the other night at a forum we were having with Farrells, but I think if everybody here went home and Googled the satellite photographs of the major world cities, they'd find out, firstly, that they had extremely interesting profiles that we've lost or are quickly losing in Hong Kong. And also that they have many, many, many piers, some old piers, some active piers, but if you look at the San Francisco waterfront, so many of the piers are actually prodding out into the water, something we can't do. We can't even build a seawall because of the protection of the harbour ordinance. That's a problem. The final session was on placemaking in the city. Kim Dovey discussed the transformation of Melbourne's waterfront from 1990, and in the process showed some very interesting photographs from the 1920s, how it's evolved, something I always really like to see. This involved a sort of all too familiar urban reconciliation, really, between the kind of different forces that drove the project and sort of dissolved the boundaries between architecture, planning, culture, and commerce, and the various public interests involved. Very clearly, the lessons learned here are valuable. They do raise obvious issues with regard to the long-term formulation of proposals for large-scale urban regeneration. I found this interesting because several years ago, going back perhaps 6 years or maybe more, I was doing a study on sustainability and asked Melbourne for their sustainability reports on the Melbourne harbourfront, and they were really excellent. So quite what happened between getting really good sustainability reports and community consultation and then perhaps an overemphasis on the private sector, I'm not too sure. But Kim did make a very interesting time run-through. I do know Federation Square. It's certainly rebranded the city. And I think the before and after photographs really illustrate this. The docks circa 1920 actually reminded me of London circa 1970. Market-led development on its own is always somewhat questionable, and I think I can see the obvious problems with regard to the context. Kim's 7 lessons are well taken, and it's worth stating, I think, that we also have, interestingly enough, 7 town planning objectives for the Hong Kong harbourfront. I won't go over these now, but I think it's highly questionable whether we can meet any of these objectives in the situation that we have at the moment. So, again, I would emphasise that Melbourne is not alone in setting politically inspired objectives which look absolutely fantastic on paper, but we don't have the mechanisms of the wherewithal, and we have too many things working in the opposite direction, and we have to address that. Tai Lee Siang from Singapore, who incidentally is also an ex-president of the Singapore Institute of Architects and president of the Singapore Green Building Council, he made, I think, a rather interesting plea not to leave the fate of cities in the battle against climate change entirely in the kind of metaphorical hands of technology. Much as in our own situation in Hong Kong, the actions of citizens do actively have to contribute to a genuinely green environment. I like this idea of love the city. It's a great slogan. Might have come from John Lennon, really. But the reality is different. In Asia, most cities have had very little time to consolidate before becoming inundated by the next stage of rural immigrants. I can't find any fault with the 12 ingredients which were set out, which virtually complement a similar diagram I was looking at the other day, and Tai Lee Sing actually showed this a little bit later in the presentation of the 12 ingredients of a smart city. So these things really, they do merge with each other in a complementary way. People in Hong Kong, unfortunately, work such long hours that they don't have much time for romance. And romantic restaurants are anyway too expensive. But I did love the illustration of the circuit board, the transmission line and the spaces. It looks exactly like a satellite photograph of Houston. Finally, Duncan Pescott. Duncan discussed the creation of places through joining the hardware with the software, which is a kind of nice way of putting it, really. And I think very correctly he does recognize three aspects of this. Strategic placemaking in terms of the attractiveness of the city for both residents and visitors. Creative placemaking, that is to say, embedding cultural aspects that have diversity and vibrancy, that is, in all honesty, notably lacking around our harbourfront. And tactical placemaking to enhance the quality of everyday life. So I actually worked on the Foster team, as did Sean from our office. So you can blame the master plan, underground servicing and underground traffic on us, really. But it really did have the aim of creating a very unique and very real pedestrian realm. And of course, the central issue was, apart from actually trying to win a competition in the first place, we did come up against many of the problematics that we've been talking about today. What are the magic ingredients that will make West Kowloon a genuine destination? And Duncan is right. We must regard this as a destination for visitors, not just locals. It would be, at the end of the day, a regional resource. And how do we develop all the good ideas for mixed use, not just 17 cultural buildings, but entertainment, recreation, vibrancy, and diversity? And I'm leaving out all the obvious things like connectivity. What we need, as Duncan said in summing up, is a truly integrative and self-sustaining environment. So I think to conclude, all this adds up to some very perceptive presentations and discussions. I hope in summing up I've sort of really tried to bring out all the salient points. They all have enormous value to urban designers, both practitioners and theorists. And as Carey stated in her conference message, the transformation of cities around the world are facing huge challenges, in particular in ways to cope with climate change and in determining the capacity for growth. So I hope we've learned from these sessions some important indicators. Thank you again to all our speakers and participants. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. That's the end of our conference today. Thank you.